public and assisted housing redevelopment program. And so the three core goals around and pillars of choice neighborhoods surround around housing, people, and neighborhood, and really trying to take really distressed public housing and assisted housing to create really high quality mixed income communities that anybody would want to live in. And how we do that is by redeveloping the housing, supporting the public housing residents who are potentially within the public housing before it's redeveloped, or in the surrounding neighborhood, and then really trying to figure out how to work with cities, foundations, private investment to really bring the amenities that a neighborhood of opportunity or a neighborhood of choice would have, and really try to work on transforming a very distressed, underinvested neighborhood into a very thriving one. So that's choice neighborhoods in a nutshell. And so choice neighborhoods data in the past and how it has been sort of transforming and what we've been learning over the years. And so we started with a lot of metrics. We were, I think at one point in time, a little bit more intimately connected with the Promise Neighborhood program. And over time, just based on different states and local contexts that we've been working in, and sort of the historian in me was trying to figure out how many times we overhauled our data system over the time. I think we've had 3 very large changes, but there's been an iterative process really since the beginning. And really kind of, you can sort of see we started with a very large number and we're shrinking down, really kind of focusing in sort of our metrics and trying to make sure that if we're collecting something, is it meaningful to our grantees and to our program? And how much autonomy and focus can we really have on those metrics and influence over them? And all of the metrics that in the data that I'll be sort of sharing a little bit of an insight with you today, it's collected on a quarterly and annual basis from all of our grantees. And just to give sort of an idea of how many grantees we're talking about, if we've ended up funding about 4 implementation grant awards a year, it's a little over 40 grants that we sort of had in existence and have sort of data on over the past 10 years. And so I end up being a sort of a data nerd, I think, a pigeonhole that somebody might put me in. I came, before working at HUD, I was with the Peace Corps in their headquarters as a monitoring evaluation specialist. And the constant questions that I think what the Choice Neighborhoods team asks itself and what we were asking the Peace Corps at the time is, data for what purpose? Are we just collecting data to collect data, or are we actually doing something with it? And are we just collecting data because we're required to? There's often a less ideal sort of situation. It might not be tailored to a local context or a local program, and it might be imposed on us by government mandates. The Choice Neighborhoods program has requirements that we have to be collecting on every year and reporting back to Congress. And many of our public housing authorities have different sort of HUD-imposed data collection and reporting requirements that may be less than ideal, but what we're always trying to strive for, what we're moving towards, is a data collection that is actually intimately linked to informing, and you'll notice the operative word there is inform, not driving decision-making, but informing how an organization learns about its success, about its weaknesses, and is able to modify and adapt their programs over time. And what I wanted to just mention too, I think often what we have around sort of data is some data myths is that we always need to be collecting data. If we have a problem and we want to find a solution to it, we need to have as many data points as possible, and more is better, which I would just say is categorically false. And I think the healthcare industry has really, and hospital systems have really actually understood this. With about 15 years ago, they really moved towards becoming a skinny data sets and focusing in their data on what really was important for them to be collecting and monitoring when someone either was admitted into a hospital throughout their stay, and then to make sure to prevent as many sort of reentries and coming back into the hospital system. And so I think you can even see sort of a little bit of trajectory with Choice Neighborhoods of moving towards maybe less is better, not necessarily focusing on all the different data metrics that we could possibly capture that we don't have a lot of control over. And then also, if you don't collect it, you can't understand the problem. which I would just tweak this always, is that if you don't analyze the data, you can't fully understand sort of what's actually trying to tell you, and really kind of focusing in on data systems and metrics that we actually have a little bit of influence over. That's something that Choice Neighborhoods has been closely sort of moving towards throughout sort of our existence. And then understanding really the limitations of our data. I always try to provide this information to either grantees who are reporting or as we're doing a data collection system, just making sure that we all know that it only tells part of a story. Our data is only as good as the data that's gathered to. For some of because the Choice Neighborhoods program is a national scope, a lot of our metrics were unable to control sort of the consistency of that data collection and make sure that, especially, and Elson will appreciate this, the data sharing agreements that we have to have between cities and housing authorities and school districts, and that free flow of information is sometimes difficult to get agreed upon. And so a great example is sort of our education data in general for public housing residents and public housing families and students. Those data sharing agreements are really elusive and look very different and aren't even collected in the same way throughout the country. And so that limits what we can actually understand through a lot of the education data that we end up receiving from school districts, and why we really encourage grantees. And this is sort of a learning of data too, is that if you're not able to fully understand something through like a data sharing agreement, maybe through our case management model, maybe through understanding FERPAs and really getting individual level student data, we can have a better understanding and support families in the education arena versus these larger data sharing agreements. And then also, just to reiterate that it only tells part of a story. The income data that many sort of federal programs use, especially around HUD, it's based on the recertification of every sort of annual year or every 2 years when a household is recertifying how much income they have coming in. It doesn't always tell the full picture. A perfect example is all these stimulus checks that were given to households during this pandemic, the boost to unemployment insurance. None of that is actually captured. And so we didn't actually know if we were putting in place a lot of those supports, we weren't actually understanding through our data how we were actually really supporting families during these past 2 years. Another sort of struggle, especially for the Choice Neighborhoods program, I think any long-term focused program where we all know change is hard, especially neighborhood level change. A perfect example of this short-term versus longitudinal data focus is that the housing voucher program, they tried to do some studies on figuring out how do those housing choice vouchers help low-income households move into neighborhoods of opportunity. And there was a short-term evaluation that was done that showed that it was likely ineffective, that it was just essentially moving poor households into other concentrated poverty pockets within a city or within a region. But if you then expand out even further over 20, 30 years, there's a long-term evaluation, a great group. If you haven't heard of Raj Chetty, please look into his group, Opportunity Insights. They did a long-term evaluation over multiple decades and really showed that housing choice vouchers combined with the support of a supportive services model, especially around housing navigators, were extremely effective in supporting families with young children get into neighborhoods of opportunity, but also a slew of other predictive metrics on child well-being and success and upward mobility, especially for the very young children. And so often when we're thinking about data, we need to really think about that time horizon of when we actually will find the effects. For the Choice Neighborhoods program, we're often limited to collect data over the course of a grant period, which is 6 years. So a lot of our metrics, we may not actually be able to see the success or true impact that they may have for a family that goes well beyond the 6 years of our grant periods. And something we've been doing at Choice Neighborhoods recently is moving towards sort of a comparative analysis. So those quarterly and annual reports that we receive from our grantees every year, we can actually put them into similar sort of pots. We understand that no matter if you were awarded in 2011 or 2018, everybody had a first reporting period. And we can have sort of figure out a trajectory for each of our grantees, and then figure out if they're on track, if they're falling behind, or if they're finding extreme success that we want to highlight and share with our other grantees. And we've found that moving a little bit more towards this comparative analysis gives us the leverage as grant managers with the Choice Neighborhoods team to really have more meaningful conversations with our grantees when we're doing sort of either, we spend a lot of time on the phone with our grantees on a monthly basis, just checking in, making sure progress is being made, and leveraging data in this way really helps us to monitor and also encourage some change management if it's needed. So just to give you an example, this is a line chart of the percentage of public housing and assisted residents who are in case management over time. This is an aggregate. These are all grantees. So this is our average. The numbers on the bottom of your screen are the reporting periods. Think of them, the one is a 3-month timestamp. So it's every quarter that we receive this information. And this is almost the life cycle of an entire grant. So 24 quarters, getting closer to 4-6 years. And we have a natural progression. So in the beginning, we're building rapport with residents, building up our case management services in the first year, and then redevelopment starts to happen. And as redevelopment sort of winds down, people are transitioning back. That's sort of the tail end where we see this little bit of a bell curve happen with our case management program. And if we take this information, these averages, and understand them a little bit better, and then compare over time for each row now that you're seeing is an individual grantee. This is something that we use to really understand if somebody is on track, off track, or really doing things that we didn't expect that are very good. So just a quick idea, these are all standard deviations, which might not mean anything to you, but just know that green is good, white is average, red is outside sort of the average or falling a little bit behind. Just to give you an idea. And so we use tools like this over a number of different metrics to understand where each of our grantees are in a point in time and how we can either help them move the needle to get into the green or the white, or understand better why they might be struggling, which there might be very, very good reasons. So this just gives us that ability to leverage data to have more meaningful conversations with housing authorities, with cities, with nonprofits who might be managing some of our supportive services. And just to sort of reiterate, I know I'm getting a little long-winded, Camille, I'll wrap up here quickly, is really trying to make sure that we understand the importance of comparing data points, not just collecting it, not just analyzing our own data, but also comparing it externally. So something that is collected and that we feel very strongly about at Choice Neighborhoods is really improving public safety through our programming. Everything is intimately sort of involved around how do we improve public safety? It's relationships with police departments, it's improving rapport and building trust with public housing residents and the wider community. It's through environmental design, how we're building our new buildings, with the streets and the lighting that's all involved in sort of promoting public safety. But without a comparison to the city, we have data that really shows that just generally across the board, violent crime goes down in a Choice Neighborhoods program. Our neighborhoods just really across the board see a decrease. But when we actually compare that to the city, we see an even more beautiful picture that comes into play. That 85% of Choice Neighborhoods saw Part 1 violent crime decrease at higher rates than that of the city. So it isn't just a trajectory of a local city or in the US, but Choice Neighborhoods is doing a little bit more than just what's happening around it. And we know that even 60% of Choice Neighborhoods saw violent crime decrease at twice the rate of the city. So there's something really meaningful that's happening when Choice Neighborhoods is able to be brought into a community, brought into a neighborhood, and have its transformation plans really go into effect. But with that, I'll pass the baton on to Elson and look forward to your questions in just a moment.
Thank you. Yes, we will get Elson's slide up here. Just a reminder, we would love any questions from the audience, so please enter them into the chat as they come up for you in these presentations. Right.
All right.
And
And
Stephanie,
so,
can you, there we go.
yeah,
There we go.
there you go.
Take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Nathan. That was a great presentation. We, like Choice Neighborhoods, have been around for since 2010. We can go to the next slide. We really do look at the work that we've done over the years. We can go to the next slide. And we, at a core, we really are the opportunity for communities, children, families, and their communities to come together to focus around great schools in their community. We're inspired by the work of the Harlem Children's Zone, but we are both a grant program and an approach. And part of that approach is looking at how we build the capacity of nonprofit organizations to look at data differently and to drive change related to good schools and education. Next slide, please. And so we have 10 results, but within those results, we have a number of indicators. And Nathan mentioned in the beginning that they had, like over 500 data points within their indicators. I think we had probably about 100, and we may have reduced them down to maybe 80. But we have the results and we have the indicators. In addition, we have the recommended sources. And so what we do is we really, through our technical assistance providers, we really, once the grantee is awarded a grant, we actually do an assessment of their application and where they are. Because sometimes what happens with an application, it really doesn't tell the complete story. It tells a story, but not the complete story. And so we try to confirm the data that they have, make sure data sharing agreements are in place, make sure that they have their IRBs in place, institutional review boards, so that they make sure that literally they can do two things. They can capture the data points at the individual student level, and then they can also capture data at the neighborhood level. If we go to the next slide. And that just kind of rounds us out. As I said, we have 10 results, and then we have all the indicators. We train our grantees around how they capture the data. Many of them have systems. Some of them are customized systems. A lot of grantees now use Salesforce. They were also using a system, let's see, through Social Solutions. And then for those that are affiliated with United Ways, they've been utilizing some of the United Way systems. And so what we attempt to do is to enhance their learning of capturing data, actually engaging residents in surveys. They actually every other year have to do a neighborhood survey. And so we try to encourage them to engage their partners and their residents in data collection, so that we're building the capacity of the organization, but also of the residents that they serve. Next slide, please. And so how are we organized? As I mentioned, we have our grantees, which may be nonprofits, institutions of higher education, or tribal organizations. Usually have a backbone organization that helps to convene across sectors. That includes the districts, school districts, families, nonprofits, and of course, housing authorities. The grantee is responsible for both administering the grant and convening and supporting the partners. So that backbone, that quarterback organization has a pretty significant job in managing relationships, managing data. You know, Nathan said this earlier about data sharing agreements, and really serving as the central nervous system in many ways of their communities. Next slide, please. And so I talked about the Promised Neighborhoods being an approach and also a grant. An approach in terms of aligning contributions, looking at the results and indicators, referring to the implementation grants and what they do. Literally using data to drive results and performance. We actually require that the lead agency provides successful oversight and management of the data. We really push them to think differently around their leaders in the community and the use of data. And so we oftentimes, we actually have a requirement that they post their annual data on their websites. We buy for them, or through their grant, we purchase the licenses of what's called the Promise Scorecard. It's through a company called, oh gosh, the name of the company, they changed the name of the company. Clear Impact. Clear Impact is the company that we contract out, and they provide the platform. And the platform is the platform they use to collect data, but then they can also report the results through their websites. And there's a way in which we teach them to do that. They also have their own case management systems. And so our platform can oftentimes communicate with the case management system. And then we take them through the last 10 years, we've taken them through a unique training where we partnered with the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and they created a 9-month training program where, once again, we're teaching our residents, our grantees, how to use data effectively through the Results Count program of Annie Casey. What we find is it's a way for our grantees and their lead community partners to speak on the same page around data. And oddly enough, our program officers also go through that training. So we're all able to speak in a way that drives the conversation around data and how they use data, which is pretty cool. Next slide, please. And so here is our kind of our system and our approach in terms of using data. We have our strategic and accountable partnerships. We make sure that we engage the community. We try to get them to think beyond just the term of our grant for sustainable financing. We really ask them to think about the systems, the policy systems, and the influence on their work. We ask them to communicate those results. So we actually have trainings around using data stories, or we in our data speak, we talk about what's the story behind the curve. So as they think about the trending of their data, what are the deeper stories that they can tell about what they're achieving, so that they're not just numbers, they can make their data come to life and personalize their data in a way, not only to funders, but just to common people to understand what they're talking about. So that's that communications piece. And then we look at, once again, as I alluded to earlier, how can we build the organization so that the organization gets something from us beyond just the dollars. We want to build the capacity, because this really is a 10-year journey. We may only be funding them for 5, but we've got to set them up so that they can sustain their programming for 10 years and beyond. Next slide, please. And so we have a model, it's called the developmental pathway of promised neighborhoods. It was something that was created in partnership with the Policy Link, which is an organization out of Oakland. And we have the various stages of promised neighborhoods. And there's some significant information beyond each of those stages. But the idea is for us to assess where our grantees are when they come in. And when they exit, they should have moved along these different stages. Now, sometimes it's unrealistic for us to suggest that they could be at stage 5 in 5 years. But if they have really moved, from stage 2 to stage 4, we've done our job. And so we really try to get grantees to understand the developmental pathway. We want them to use this as their marker, and then we also use it as a marker for ourselves. Next slide, please. And so what are some of the lessons learned? We actually have, through Mathematica, a longitudinal study that's going on of promised neighborhoods. We're really focused at this point on the 2011 and 2012 grantees because they've gone through full implementation. Some of our current grantees, 2016, 2017, 2018, we're not focused on them right now. Part of the reason is because of the pandemic and the changes that have occurred as a result of the pandemic. And so the longitudinal study is really focused on the 2011 and 2012s. We've got some case study work that's also going on about what we're doing. And then, of course, the individual grantees themselves have their own implementation evaluations that they must do. And our TA provider helps them with that. And so once again, some of those lessons learned of navigating both the program and the approach, as I mentioned earlier, engaging their partners in understanding data, measuring and managing both at the population level, at the program level. It's an interesting dance for our grantees to really understand that, you're not just measuring your program, you're measuring the neighborhood. And so that's that interesting pivot in getting them to understand it's beyond just a program. You really are measuring your neighborhood level success. We push them to think about their typical organizational roles and structure. What I mean by that is sometimes coming in, our grantees, think, hey, we're collaborating with our partners. This is a collaborative venture. And we say, yes, that's true, but you really are a community quarterback. You really are a backbone. And how can you act accordingly? And so we really try to get them to think differently about their roles in their community. We also encourage them to strengthen and deepen their relationships with the school districts and the individual schools. And then most importantly, thinking beyond the 5-year period of their grant. Next slide, please. And so lesson learned, number one, this work requires navigating both the grant program and the approach. The grant is a tool. It's a catalyst, but we're talking about an approach that hopefully will sustain and change the organization for the better and help to guide them for better success throughout the livelihood of the grant and of the program. We can go to the next lesson. This work really does engage partners in understanding the data really looking at root causes. And so, you know, I talked about that training that Casey does with our programs and Center for Study of Social Policy. And part of that training is, what is the story behind the curve? What is the story behind the data? What are some of those underlying root causes that our grantees should be thinking about? And then designing solutions accordingly. And then how partners come into play. They can't do this alone, so they've got to engage their partners where their partners are and understanding the strengths and weaknesses of those partners. And then, of course, including the young people and their families in the design and implementation of their program. Next slide, please. This work really does, as I alluded to earlier, it requires them to pivot from program level to population level. Because ideally, we want them to change the trajectory of their neighborhoods. And so you can't just think about a program if you're going to change the trajectory of your neighborhoods. You really do require, or we hope for them to hold performance at both the program and system level. Next slide, please. And then really rethinking the roles of their organization and even their partners. You know, oftentimes our grantees come in with a very familiar approach of how they're working and how they're working with their partners, but we push them to think differently. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I think what's important is getting them to think deeper about their relationships, getting them to think about the root causes, and then looking at their systems and policies of their government, their district, their cities, and how that affects the work that they're doing. Next slide, please. And then, of course, because this is something, I mean, it's an education grant, right? So we really hope that they strengthen the relationship with their schools and districts. If we're going to help them create great schools, they've got to work closely with their schools and school districts. As Nathan alluded to earlier, it is a significant hurdle to have a data sharing agreement with the school district, but that's one of the first hurdles that they actually learn to work and navigate around, which is obtaining that data sharing agreement with the school district. Next slide, please. And then looking at the various segments of the pipeline, I mean, they have a significant breadth and depth of areas that they must cover from cradle to career. Intergenerational work, I mean, these are big grants. They're $6 million a year for 5 years with a dollar for dollar match. And so we really think and hope that they have a phased in approach about their work and they're able to sustain it beyond the 5 years. Next slide, please. So for prospective applicants, we hope to have a grant application out during the summer. We really hope you consider some of these questions that we have, not only for you, but the coalition of partners that you would bring to the table for this grant opportunity. And I'm sure you do the same thing for choice neighborhoods. But think about these questions before you apply. You have a lot of time, but these are some key things that you want to consider. And next slide, please. And same thing. These are just some key questions that you should consider before applying. But we think leveraging our grants and also considering leveraging our grants with HUD Choice Neighborhoods One of the things that was placed in the budget document for FY22 is that we look at the issue, as Nathan alluded to, community violence. And part of the thing that we will be working towards is how applicants are leveraging other federal programs to address community violence. And that gives you all that opportunity to leverage and use additional federal dollars for Promise Neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Once again, lead agency capacity. Next slide, please. And then final thoughts. This is much more than a 5-year grant. We want this grant to be transformational for the work you're doing in the community. We've provided a significant technical assistance support for our grantees, and we believe it's an incredible opportunity to build or strengthen your community infrastructure. And then we have a very short video, about a 4-minute video that covers 3 communities and the work that they're doing vis-a-vis COVID. And we think our grants are in a great position to use what's happening with this pandemic as an opportunity to transform their communities. And that should be it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elson. That was a fantastic presentation. We will go into a little discussion now. Stephanie, can I get you to stop sharing your screen? Thank you. And this is again a plug for putting any questions you might have in the chat, please. Great. So one of the things I'm so excited about these presentations, because so many of the people on the phone today on this meeting are engaging in their own types of initiatives, doing multi-site, cross-sector type of work, bringing people together from many different sectors, trying to make community change. But I think a lot of us have that question of, but how do we measure it? You know, it seems a little squishy. And you all are really the experts. I know you all both discussed about how some of the sites have really shaped their own activities in the grant programs to kind of local context and whatnot. Have you all tailored your metrics or data collection at all based on the types of activities each of the sites are undertaking?
I can start. One of the important things about our grant is that we have this wonderful, I'm putting it in quotes, wonderful. We have a requirement called GEPRA, the Government Performance Result Act. It was actually 1993 that this was created, and they're measures that are associated with our statute. And as a result, we pass those measures down to grantees. It's like the effectiveness of our program. So from the standpoint, we have set measures. So under my slide deck, those indicators that I showed are actually the Government Performance Result Act measures that are required as a part of the grant. Now, there are program measures that grantees can have. So if you have a logic model, think of our outcomes as the end outcomes, but there might be performance measures that our programs have and measure that help get to our GEPRA measures, if that makes sense. And so that's where the uniqueness of a program can come in. You may have your unique program measures, but ultimately the reporting to us are the GEPRA measures. And so that's the way we try to frame it. You know, we have the requirements of Congress because it is a requirement from Congress, but we try to frame it in a way that's individual. They're based on the individual needs assessments of the communities that apply for our grants.
Gotcha. So the overall goals of all of the sites has to be the same. It's the 10 basic measures, and then how they're getting there is changing.
That's right. Yep.
Gotcha. Nathan?
If I could add, yeah, a little bit to that, it's very similar. And we have, so I guess there's two parts to answer that question. The first I would always say is that how you want to define success is really what's important. And figuring out what is the end goal, and then through backwards design, sort of, or whether it's a logic model or what have you, is figuring out what is our goal of our program? What do we actually want to see changing, or what change do we want to see either in individuals and housing in the neighborhood? And then backwards design, how do then we collect information that will help inform us if we're actually doing that or not? And not that all programs are started that way. We have congressional mandates as well, based on our statute that we have every grantee need to report on. And we always encourage grantees to go beyond that. What's important to them in their neighborhood, and how they get there often is sometimes very different. So if the goal is increasing the income of public housing residents throughout this transformation process, the how is often somewhat different depending on the site and the relationships that they have in the local context. But at the same time, we have found over time, and we have learned as a program, that there are certain pieces of the puzzle that are pretty consistent across sites. And what we've learned, and what we're starting to encourage even as a program on the people pillar, really focusing on workforce development. So we can increase sort of access to benefits to improve income. But we have constantly seen when there's a workforce development specialist somewhere in the mix, whether it's at the housing authority or at a partner or within the city, and they're working intimately with the public housing residents, we have seen consistent sort of larger increases in income over the trajectory of the grant. And so that helped inform our policy and our encouragement of what we are trying to see grantees involved in, and how they're operating under. Very similar to just how quickly they're spending the funds. We know after like 2 or 3 years, if funds aren't being spent, we get a little worried that it's not actually, their burn rate isn't consistent. And so our grant management team is always touching base with the grantee. So I think it's a combination of understanding what you want success to look like, and then through backwards design, figuring out what you want to collect to make sure that can happen. But then also figuring out how to be responsive to what you're receiving, and figuring out how you can adapt and modify either a program or your organization to adapt appropriately.
Great, thank you. Now, kind of a related theme, there's some real challenges of tying some programmatic activities into some of those population level changes that we all would like to see. How have you all kind of thought about that and tailored your metrics to tie in the programmatic activities to the population change?
Elson, I think you're muted. I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, that's a good one. One of the things that I think I alluded to you earlier about, we try to take our grantees through a training with Annie Casey and also the Center for the Study of Social Policy. One of the first things that we do is I mentioned this, we do our TA provider, which is Urban, they do an assessment of their metrics that they've submitted. It's actually called the data plan. And they look at the data plan along with the solutions, and they try to make sure that the data plan solutions and the metrics that they provide actually matches with the needs assessment that they say that they're conducting, or that they have conducted. And so one of the things that I think is important is this idea of double checking with the grantee, making sure their data plans are in place. It's part of that kind of backward mapping that Nathan talked about. But what we find is that it actually has built the capacity of the organization to think deeply about their performance measures and also their ultimate outcomes, and how they are approaching the work through their solutions. That it's kind of complex, but it's an important way for them to think about it, so that their performance measures match what they want to do, along with what we require. And that way, the grantee in year one is clear on the direction that they're taking. And part of that, I think, is it's building the capacity for them to understand data, while at the same time confirming that these are the things that they have agreed to and that we collectively are moving forward on how to do it.
That's great. And just to add on to that, I think there's to use sort of what Elsa was sharing about promised neighborhoods being an approach versus just sort of a program. Similar, I think that's how we view choice neighborhoods as well, as that it's a different approach than most neighborhoods are redeveloped, and giving different groups voice throughout that process and influence. And really, I think understanding too, sort of how sort of our data is reflective of the needs of the community. I think Elsa, you just said it great. So making sure that what you're collecting is responsive to the needs, and that's a very large component typically of a choice neighborhoods program, is there is a needs assessment that's conducted both at the neighborhood and for the individuals in HUD-assisted housing, and really making sure that whatever plan and strategies that they come up with are really intimately linked to those assessments. We like to call them the assets and needs assessments. I think we often forget that there are so many assets in an impoverished community too that we can tap into, and figuring out then how do we then collect data that is actually honoring that assessment, and then being responsive to it and modifying it throughout the process. And I think a good question I just saw that came into the chat too from Nancy is how your data collection methods, like how they support people who exit the program, who leave the school, who leave the neighborhood. And that is a constant struggle. I think those are tough discussions because we lose access to those households, those families. But at the same time, the way our data system is created is not only do we collect individual household level data, but then thinking about neighborhood level data that hopefully collects some of that that change that we're seeing on a sort of a larger scale than at the sort of the minute. So taking it from different sources. So not relying on one data system or data source, but figuring out how do you cobble together sort of both sort of city level, neighborhood level, and federal level through their census data, through USPS, the Postal Service. They have a lot of information on neighborhood level sort of indicators and metrics, and how you cobble together all of that then with your own systems at the individual and household level data.
Great. And Elson, I also wanted to give you the opportunity to answer the question in the chat as well. Do you all do anything to collect data from families that have left the neighborhoods or schools?
We don't, meaning the federal government doesn't,
Sure.
but we definitely encourage our grantees to through their case management systems. And so once again, we encourage them to be able to track data at that individual student level. That's part of the initial challenge of those data sharing agreements, because it's exactly that. We want our grantees to be able to track those children who may be falling off as a result of chronic absenteeism. I mean, that's part of the strategy, right? If you saw or you'll see, I think it might be indicator 6, which is around chronic absenteeism. So once again, the idea is that they're able to have conversations around, at the classroom level, but then at the same time, how do those metrics affect at the systems level? They have to be able to talk both levels. And that's part of the complexity of the program, is building the capacity of the organization to think about those families that are being challenged, that might be falling through the cracks. And then literally we went through rulemaking, and one of the rulemaking comments or aspects that we had to build to our program were navigators. And so Nathan talked about, navigators for housing. You think about us having navigators for education, or as families in the Latino communities will call them, the promotores. And so having those individuals who are of and from the community, being able to use their experience in a way, as parents, as grandparents, to help others navigate through the system.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to squeeze in one last question. I have so many for you, but we'll end on this one. Both of you have talked about engaging residents and participants of these programs into the design and leadership and evaluation of these programs. Do you have any key recommendations for how to do that, or any highlights that one exemplar situation that you'd like to highlight?
Sure. Just because it's sort of fresh in my mind, it's actually a grantee. So we have both our planning sort of grants. That's really the planning of the transformation process, and that I love our sort of model, is that it really kind of is intentionally involving public housing residents in the wider neighborhood. But going beyond that, we've had a few grantees recently working with school districts, actually in California, working with the teachers in the local neighborhood school to help them understand what a transformation process for choice neighborhoods would look like, working with the students then too, helping them understand, helping them share their voice and their opinions and desires during design, excuse me, sessions of the program, and really kind of making that sort of next level effort of really trying to understand the community and build that rapport and trust, because often, like a lot of programs, change is disruptive, especially when we're talking about redeveloping properties. And we've seen some really, really impressive models, and also trying to help grantees understand who is the best messenger, who's the best receiver of some of this information that you're talking about, those hard to reach populations. It might not always be a government body, it might not be a housing authority or a city. It might best be a nonprofit that has an already established relationship. It might be a combination of the two or three, and really trying to allow people to understand that there might be other entities that are just better positioned to do some of the work that we'd like to be see done, just because they're just naturally inherent sort of relationship dynamics that are hard to overcome as you're trying to really reach out and involve and include households that may have not been included before.
And I would just say one of the most exciting programs that we participated in, it was like a dual generation program. And what ended up happening were parents were engaged in early childhood development activities for their kids. And these were immigrant parents. We then found out that a lot of those parents needed skill building. And so we not only provided training for the parents to work with their students or their children around early childhood development, but then we found the skill sets and skill building needs of parents, worked with the local community college, and they were able to do some workforce development work for the parents. So adult education. So yeah, early childhood education, adult education. We also had, oddly enough, they called it a civic engagement academy for residents. So those same residents were then also involved in understanding their local government. And one of the great things about that was that eventually one of the parents ended up working for the Backbone organization. And then she went, and it was 2 years ago, ran for the school board and got it. And so, you know, when you talk about kind of building the capacity of residents to do this work, a dual generation model where the parents can teach their kids how to, the parents can be taught how to work closely with their child in early childhood, but then we're also figuring out ways to build the skill sets of adult learners so that they can move to the next level of economic progress through education. So those are a couple of examples, and it's exciting to see that type of sustainability in our communities.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that is a wonderful note to end on today. We're just over the hour, so I will let everybody go. And thank you so much for joining us. This has been so insightful, and I hope everybody's learned a lot from this webinar. So thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see you, Nathan.
Good to see you too, Allison.